Dear friends, colleagues, students, I have the pleasure to present Claudia Bernardi from the Università degli Studi di Perugia, but she is in Roma today. So Claudia is Associate Professor of History of the Americas in the University of Perugia, and she is a Principal Investigator of a mobility regime project, of which she will speak today, and she has written articles, but her first monograph is una storia di confine, is a story of the frontiers. And she has been fellow in the most important, as I see it, most important global history institutions, Harvard, Ghent, now Bonn, sure, Berlin, and Basel also. And she will speak about braceros, as we all have read in her abstract. I will only add two ideas. The concept of braceros is very important for us and very important for global history of slavery. It is in itself, as bracero is a concept after slavery, I think. In slavery, I have it as brazos for sugar slavery. That means they need strong arms for beating sugar, and hands in cotton and coffee, because they need many hands for harvesting coffee and cotton. So this will be very interesting for us. And now the floor is open for you, Claudia, please.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank Jan Herber for the organization of this lecture, and Michael Zoyski for the introduction, and the Bond Center for Dependency and Labor Studies for this kind of invitation, which is very much appreciated. I'm very grateful for joining the vibrant debate you have set up through this lecture series and the meetings you host. And obviously, I thank everybody for being here. As said, today I'm presenting an ongoing research of mine, which is part of the project Essentia, the mobility regime across Mexico and the United States, a case of farm workers from Tabasco and Oaxaca from 1930s to 1970s. In particular, I'm going to discuss that part of research which is tentatively entitled ¿Qué es un bracero?, which means what is a bracero, questioning dependency and desires from the perspective of Mexican contract workers. And I hope this lecture will be in dialogue with one of the center's main challenges, that is to investigate labor-related asymmetrical dependencies and mobility by considering a historical process which took place in mid-20th century and involved Mexican contract workers aiming to work temporarily in the United States. So I will question the asymmetrical relations and dependencies, not in relation to slave or convict labor, not to debt bondage or serfdom or servitude, but in the case of contract labor. When we overcome, let's say, the dichotomy free and free labor by adopting the broader articulation of coerced labor, we are then allowed to look at the resonances between different forms of coercion beyond the juridical status of workers. In other terms, while contract should provide a set of guarantees and protection to workers, its breach or non-implementation draw this labor form to others that were once assigned to the category of unfree labor. So while contract is often considered a guarantee of freedom from various perspectives, for instance, in liberalism or even in socialism, it actually introduced forms of undesired immobilization in Mexico and coercion in both countries. And this happened in North America during the so-called Glorious 30, or the golden age of capitalism, when the United States of America made of labor rights one of the main pillars of its anti-communist propaganda. So first, I'm going to briefly present the broad historical context and introduce you to the so-called Bracero, providing the basic data and information about the overall labor mobility program. Second, I will present some aspects of asymmetrical relations that were generating among various historical actors at play and the benefits from these relations for specific social groups or state departments. And in particular, I will focus on immobilization as the truly new practice which introduced a novel form of coercion that created an asymmetrical relation. My thesis is that immobility is a form of coercion that rework asymmetrical relations and establish new ones also in Mexico and not only in the United States. And third, I will explore the use of asymmetrical relations to the benefit of workers. I will draft some provisional conclusion for the understanding of Mexican contracts workers' perspective about dependent relation with U.S. actors and the desire they nurtured through and despite the labor mobility program. As we will see, coercion can be refused, but also used by workers on the move. And for doing this, I will rely primarily on sources from the Mexican National Archive, Archivo General de la Nación, and oral sources from US online Bracero Archive. So first, what is the so-called Bracero program? In late 19th century, the term bracero in Mexico was employed for identifying landless peasants who were temporarily employed in United States fields. Literally in Spanish, braceros are those individuals who use their arms, from the word brazo, arm. And also in Italian language, actually, the term bracciante comes from the word braccio, arm, and was similarly employed for identifying workers employed in low-skilled tasks that mainly require muscular power since the late 18th century, let's say. In Mexico, the term entered the public discourse by depicting a clear image of the migrant workers' function. Migrants are reduced to their body parts needed to work. They are reified and degraded by the inner workings of this labor regime. So while Bracero took the stage of public debate and institutional discourses during World War II, the term had been applied also to previous experience of labor-managed migration in the area, substantiating the idea of Mexican workers as a reserve army of labor, a well-known concept in Marx's critique of political economy. But put in the sterile language of diplomacy, so to speak, braceros are the objects of negotiation in a series of bilateral agreements between Estados Unidos de Mexico and the United States of America that were stipulated in 1942 for importing Mexican workers to be employed in railroad maintenance and southwestern fields. The agreement went on record as Emergency Farm Labor Agreement in the United States and Convenio Migratorio de Trabajo in Mexico. And despite these formal names, it became popular as Programa Bracero Program. It legalized the import of migrants as a temporary measure due to the exceptionality of the Second World War, but the agreement was renewed until 1964 through Public Law 78 in the United States, following strong pressure from US growers in the agreement with Mexican governments, but despite the opposition of US unions, Mexican growers, and large parts of Mexican and US society. And this kind of agreement has been labeled in various ways by scholars, and here we'll refer to it as a labor mobility program, which was sponsored by states. The state-sponsored program of labor mobility starting during the war as a fundamental resource for fighting the war, when the growers stressed a labor shortage argument, and I quote, for which the only evidence provided is the assertion of employers themselves. Federal regulatory agencies, as well as most members of Congress, accepted employer attestation as factual and without need of verification, end quote. But we may wonder, who is dependent to what in relation to the scarcity of labor? The long and loud cry of growers, as it was called in the United States, was not the only one, but could stand for the general demand by growers, both in US and Mexico, to get tractable, disposable, and cheap workers. In fact, since the early 1940s, in the states of Chiapas, Coahuila, Durango, Jalisco, Guanajuato, Hidalgo, Michoacán, Morelos, Oaxaca, Puebla, Tabasco, Veracruz, and Yucatan, many landowners, growers, unions, and local representatives complained about the abandoned fields. Complaints in Mexico turned into the clear demand for ending the program and introducing measures, and I quote, to prevent the exodus of braceros, end quote. They opposed the program in many Mexican states, denouncing the mobility of peasants as a proper exodus from the country, decrying the abandonment of the nation by peasants that had become bracero through their mobility. These demands were not limited to the first years of the program, and even during El Milagro, which was the Mexican economic expansion of 1950s, there were protests and requests for interrupting the program. Still, even in 1954, after the repatriation of more than 1 million undocumented migrants and contract workers under so-called Operation Wetback in the United States, there was a demand for workers in Mexico. And again, labor representatives requested the end of the program. The alleged labor shortage in US was then paralleled with labor shortage in Mexico too, whereas we considered the growers' perspective of both countries. As a matter of fact, both the US and Mexican growers claimed a labor scarcity argument for soliciting the importation and mobility of workers. And I'd like to show you some data about the programs during which in these 22 years, 5 million contracts, nearly 5 million contracts were awarded. Nearly 10 million Mexican workers were on the move and entered the United States. 8 recruitment centers were established. 94% of these workers worked in US border states, so in the agricultural field, above all in California, Arizona, and Texas, and 40% permanently moved to United States. And here you can see with a dark blue the states, US states receiving braceros, which were many of the Confederation, and the states in light blue from Mexico who were sending bracero. As a matter of fact, the states like Guanajuato, Jalisco, Michoacán, and part of Guerrero, and in particular this area between the first 3 states called El Bajío, were the ones who sent the largest number of braceros. Nonetheless, there was a system of quota which established a minimum and maximum number of workers that could be recruited for each Mexican state. And here you can see the recruitment center. In the smallest image, there is the recruitment center established in Mexico City, in the stadium of the city, which worked in 1942 and 1943. And then after, many others were established, and actually it was the so-called headache for the negotiation about the places in which this recruitment center had to be located. So from 1955 to 1962, we have these 7 recruitment center running. And there was a debate about the location and negotiation, so they changed in these 22 years. And so the most relevant ones were actually the ones in Sonora, Hermosillo, and Monterrey. But in order to enter the recruitment process, aspiring braceros had to provide a birth certificate, a health certificate, and the recommendation of moral equality. So before arriving to this recruitment center, they needed to have all these documents. And if all the documents were accepted, they had to pass a physical exam. So they received a chest X-ray to check if they had tuberculosis mainly, a rectal exam, a detailed inspection of their entire naked body. And their hands were checked to see if they were callous, to prove they were agricultural workers. Then they would have been fumigated with DDT, and at the end of the process, they would receive an identification card called MICA, which is the one you can see at the bottom of this image. This is a representation. It identifies the main paths that correspond to the process of recruitment, the mobility of workers as it was formally established. So workers moved from the reception centers in Mexico, then to the recruitment center that were mainly placed in the border area of Mexico, even if for some years some recruitment centers were also placed in the US border area, and finally to the US fields in which they were employed. After the end of the contract, they were supposedly brought back to the Mexican recipient center by the employer. This is a map drawn upon a single oral history of Juan Loza, was a bracero, and he made 3 travels to United States, and in the red line there is his final trip as he migrated to United States at the end of the Bracero program. And it gives, yes, a general idea of the main movements of workers, but nonetheless, I think this is a very incomplete map because it does not highlight the asymmetrical relations within the paths of immobility. And for this, I will return to the topic of speciality of coercion later to discuss this issue. Before, I'd like to introduce the main features of the contract that Mexican workers had to sign and the obligation that employers and states had to respect and follow. First, contracts must be written in Spanish and English, as you can see from this image, which is a sample of contract that was signed in 1945. And the binational agreement mandated that employers had to provide housing comparable to that of domestic workers, which had hygienic lodgings with the medical and sanitary services. They also had to provide comparable prevailing wages at the minimum level of work guarantee, as there was a minimum working hours per week. So if they work under a period equal to 75% of the period for which the workers had been contracted, they shall receive a subsistence allowance at the rate of $3 per day. They also should provide transportation and living expenses from the place of origin to destination and return, as well as expenses incurred in the fulfillment of any requirement of a migratory nature, and also a retirement deduction. And Mexican contracting United States should not be engaged in any military service and should not suffer discrimination acts of any kind. But which are the forms of coercion and asymmetrical relation established by contract labor and the overall recruiting process? So despite this contract and regulation of workers' recruitment, labor mobility is a process beginning with the departure of workers from their homes and extending across the entire trajectory, as mobile workers are already productive before their arrival at the recruitment center and remained so after they returned. And Mexican society was deeply involved in this elaborate process, established and exploited by various actors across a multi-scale space. And that's why that map I showed you before, I think it is incomplete. It does not take into account the movement towards the recruitment center from their very home. So it was the very process of the mobilization since the beginning that was, for instance, the origin of debt, as prospective braceros needed money both to reach the processing center and to obtain the documents required for access to the program. These costs were incurred not only by recruited workers who would subsequently have the possibility to repay their debts, but also by workers rejected at the processing center in Mexico due to health problems, lack of required documents, or undesired profiles or traits. In northern Mexico, workers had to perform unpaid field work, picking cotton in order to receive a certificate allowing them to be recruited. Testimonies emphasize the payment of bribes to get there faster, meaning that it was time Mexicans were paying for, not only the access. Bribes were required not only to gain access to the selection process, but also to get in more quickly than others. And all these means made contract workers dependent on a set of historical actors, which included illegal recruiters called coyote, The foreman was mayordomo, commissioners, military officers, both in US and Mexico, mayors, local and state government officials, immigration policemen, doctors, and even family members or relatives. As we said, and once arrived at the recruitment centers, migrants received a detailed inspection of their entire naked body. On one side, this meant they could pay for false X-ray and false health certificates, as doctors accepted bribes to let them pass despite having tuberculosis, for instance. On the other side, this detailed inspection, which included rectal and teeth exams, while all migrants were naked in the same room, allowed for submissive relations, as migrants testified to feel deeply embarrassed by the process. And because of this feeling, some of them preferred to work as undocumented to avoid the inspection. But the distribution of processing and recruitment centers, together with labor pools and mobility routes, created a complex space that prospective braceros had to navigate for a certain period. Waiting at the recruitment center represented an obstacle in the path of mobility and a black hole in which workers were kept in uncertainty and timelessness. They often had to wait for days or months before obtaining a contract despite their eligibility, and they were unaware of how long they would have to wait before being employed in the fields. In other words, they were immobilized in a state of limbo. Waiting times outside the processing center can be considered a form of coercion as well, since they induced indebtedness after the recruitment process, but before employment. And transportation from the recruitment center to the farm, so as daily transportation from the farm to the field, was unsafe, was irregular, was not always available to bring workers back to Mexico. This image of a newspaper refers to an accident that took place on a Bracero's way from the field to the farm in 1963. And it was one of the latest and one of the worst, but many more happened before. The asymmetrical relations were created and improved at various scales and levels between Mexico and United States, among US departments and agencies, between local, state, and federal governments in US, but above all in Mexico, between workers and local officers and recruiters, unions, associations, and family networks. Almost all conditions established by the agreement and the contract Mexican workers signed were often breached. In this regard, there are testimonies from braceros, unions, both Mexicans and US one, from Mexican consuls and the press. Sometimes the text of the contract written in English did not correspond to the Spanish version, which was the only version that could be read by workers. Housing was often barracks, food was poor, and a minimal level of work was not always provided. Wages were lower, and transportation, as said, was unsafe. So Mexicans also suffered discriminations, racist attacks by white US citizens, and restaurants and cinemas prohibited their entrance or were only allowed in the African American sections. For this, asymmetrical relations were recreated also through the Bracero Program, as US actors, in particular growers, considered the working condition offered to Bracero much better to the ones they thought Mexicans would experience in their home country. In other terms, they could lower working conditions because these conditions were presented and represented as better than the Mexican ones, as if there would be the general Mexican condition of work to be compared to the one of southwestern US fields that employed braceros. The difference between these two conditions, of which one is completely a construct and the generalization, reinforced the asymmetry between the countries and the working condition they could offer. And the mobility labor program also created forms of unfreedom by bonding a worker to a specific employer and not allowing them to settle or remain permanently, and hence producing an expellable subject if the employee was found not working for the assigned employer, which may happen very often. Asymmetrical relations were also evident in Mexico. For instance, Mexican border officials were used to seize braceros' belongings at their return to get their share. An unfair theft, for sure, that in the officer's view played the role of rebalancing the living condition of those who could not move for better their lives. While historiography highlights always the role of mobility, I would emphasize the role of immobility as a constituent part of the overall process. Immobilization is a form of coercion which implements dependent relation between historical actors, and various forms of immobilization can be employed within the same regime. Control over labor, coercion and indebtment, exploitation of waiting times, and molding workers into disposable subjects. Whereas the process of selection and recruitment was protracted and complex, the control over workers that resulted in immobilization was much more immediate. And I quote, "If you violated a 45-day contract and didn't come home on time, they wouldn't renew your contract. They wouldn't let you go back to US another time." Every bracero, regardless of the availabilities of fields to pick, had to stay on his assigned farm until the end of his contract and return to Mexico immediately thereafter unless the contract was renewed. The mobilization at the worksite was complementary to the rapid mobilization at the end of the contract, and the contract, in combination with the mobility imposed by the employer's control practices, restricted each worker to a specific location and bound him to the employer under penalty of deportation, that is, forced mobility. Various forms of immobilization were employed by formal and informal actors, institutions, officer representatives, and other legal as well as non-legal individuals and groups profited from this complex mechanism. The wide range of required credential, unpaid work, deduction fees, deposits, debts, bribes, taxes, uncertain contracts, waiting times, and shifting schedules form constitutive components of a well-established labor mobility regime that coerced workers along their paths of mobility, at their sites of immobilization, and through their expectation. But what did Mexicans think about these dependencies? Can we get their perspective about these asymmetries? The movement of peasants from Mexico to the recruitment center took on the form of an exodus, according to the money letters sent to the presidents of Mexico in the first decade of the program. In some cases, the presidents were also reached by citizens who provided for disparate solutions to cope with the exodus of braceros. For instance, the engineer Mate Gomez of the Secretaría of Agricultura y Fomento received a letter from Salvador Castro Rivera from Zacatecas in 1944. It was 2 years after the beginning of the guest worker program, labor mobility program, and during the ongoing fights of the Second World War. And Salvador Castro Rivera is writing from the perspective of those who are fighting for the increase of agricultural workers' numbers in Mexican fields and have a direct knowledge of events. And he presents a detailed and clean image of the percentage of departed workers from the state of Zacatecas, the estimates of return ones, and data about remittances and total earnings of Bracero in some municipality of the states. And then he acknowledged the undeniable benefits of peasants' family for having acquired cattle, agricultural tools, household goods, and in general to have increased their purchasing power. But besides these economic benefits, the engineer identifies the cultural added value of this experience. Either they decided to be recruited another time as contract workers, or they were satisfied with a single contract. In his words, in 100% of the cases, they improved their democratic consciousness, as they had met officials, authorities, and relevant persons, as they acted as common men and without privileges. For the Mexican government of Avila Camacho at that time, the term democracy was a new entry of the political language due to the involvement of Mexico in the war aside of the Allies, the Democratic Alliance against Nazi fascism. At the same time, its use was a step aside from the ideals of socialism that Cardenismo, which referred to the previous government, sprouted in the past decade. So Castro Rivera interpreted the labor mobility of peasants to the United States as the possibility of increasing their democratic ideals through the experience with the privilege of the North, and increasing their personalidad ciudadana, so their identity as citizens, and showing how the triad citizenship, democracy, nationalism found its way in Mexico already during World War II. And following this source, we could understand the Bracero Program politically aligned Mexico to the United States by spreading Western values, empowered peasants by increasing their purchasing power, and it seems that the program rebalanced, at least partially, the existing dependent relation, if we consider this perspective. And in this letter, Castro Rivera always kept together the economic benefits and the cultural shift that peasants underwent. And I quote, "Returning Bracero brings emulation concerns," end quote. In fact, he reports the evaluation of returned Braceros that he collected who affirmed the Braceros, and I quote, up there we did a lot because we worked a lot, and we can do much more here too. We want to work here in Mexico as we saw what it has to be done, and we know how to do it," end quote. So besides this general evaluation of the programs, he reports the conversation he had with returned Braceros. The worker perspective reported by the Zacatecan engineer ascertained the substantial difference between Mexico and US, where much has to be done, as a consequence of the work. In their view, this work would allow Mexico to catch up with the northern neighbor, as it is actually possible because Mexican contract workers learned how to do it and above all wish to employ their acquired knowledge in Mexico. So their desire brings them back to the mother country that would benefit from the work if they would be put in the condition of improving the national economy. And this attitude to imitate what they experienced in US agricultural fields suggested him to propose to the president of selling machinery, agricultural implements, and to organize more property investment. And this kind of proposal resonated with the government's ambitions. It was not only the war effort to require Mexican exportation of labor, but an internal political reason. And I quote, "When workers come back to Mexico, they bring back knowledge and aspiration that can benefit Mexico too," end quote. So the president was addressing the interested state departments for a set of reasons. In first place, to balance the foreign pressure from the allies with the national interests by presenting the benefits of the exportation of labor. And in second place, the exportation of labor was equal with the importation of skill, which was presented as an educational and formative experience, which was realized through labor mobility. And in third place, there was a cultural added value, as Bracero would have more aspiration and become more ambitious. In sum, it was a balanced relation with benefits for those countries. Nonetheless, the government was aware of the much efforts needed to re-employ workers. Colonization in the northern area of Mexico was then planned to promote the immigration of former Braceros and cope with the national high rate of unemployment, which could turn the importation of contract workers into a form of dependency, both for wage earned and for remittances. On the other side, the US aimed at renovating the binational agreement for the extremely favorable condition of Mexican labor importation. And this situation was acknowledged by many actors, among which the Alliance of National Workers of Mexico and the United States, that wrote to Mexican President Avila Camacho about the benefits of the renewal of the labor program. And I quote, "It benefits our worker as he will not be employed, as he will not be unemployed and idle," end quote. So besides his condition of unemployed, Mexican peasant workers is seen as lazy, ocioso. In particular, peasants live in a state of misery, above all those who does not possess land in any form. So this primary source acknowledges both the condition of Mexican peasants as lazy subjects who have to be educated to contract work in a foreign democratic country, as much as their condition of landless peasants that are not entitled of collective land possession, which turn them into unemployed workers. So they experience a double condition. They are left in a condition of poverty and potential dependency by the state because of lack of land, but also they are a sort of incomplete subjects because uneducated to the sacrifices of work. So these sources suggest simultaneously the relation between nations, governments, but also the relation between workers and both the labor mobility program as the national politics like the agrarian reform and decolonization projects in the North were not able to cope with. In other words, the relation questions various scales from the subjective or body dimension till the transnational one. And a further source provides insight into these many relations that make up the mobility regime and shed light on the workers' perspective. For instance, Plutarcos y Baja Arango writes from the agricultural field of Somis labor camp in California to the president of Mexico. So he writes while he was still in United States, presenting to the president of Mexico the imbalance they suffer since their departure. And I quote, "Many of us become bracero because of the precarious condition we live in our country, even if it is because of some of our relatives' illness. And as it means a disbursement, it means it is an imbalance of our economic situation. That's why we become bracero, for the hope of repaying that debt," end quote. So the imbalance, desequilibrio, clearly speaks about the asymmetries experienced by workers in the overall process of mobility from Mexico to United States and back. The imbalance and the coercion that Bracero had to experience is very clear from this source. And furthermore, Cibaja Arango reports the way in which he was addressed by the Mexican Vice Consul Ernesto Romero, who allegedly received a bribe of $300 from the ranch owner when he asked about being recruited again. And the Vice Consul talked to Cibaja, and Cibaja reports what he said to the Mexican president, and I quote, "Oh, Mr. Cibaja, you are not a bracero. That's why you protest, because you're used to be a bracero. Because those who truly are a bracero eat what they are served, even if it's water and bread, and they do not protest. Now you understand what is a bracero, and you are not." While explaining Cibaja that he can't protest for the abuses suffered, he's providing us with a clear-cut definition of what it means to be a bracero, accepting any form of coercion without protesting. And this true asymmetry was reinforced all the more when Ernesto Romero affirmed that the fault of mistreatment was of the braceros, and I quote, "It was braceros' own guilt," end quote. In some, they were blamed for being abused as for they deserved it. Another testimony comes from Guadalajara in Jalisco, a letter sent by Enrico Mercado to the president of Mexico, Manuel Avila Camacho, in 1942, when bracero were about to embark on their first travel to Californian fields. Candidly explicit about bracero's role, Mercado wrote, and I quote, "The product of their work that is transformed in dollars gives a 5-time profit in our republic," end quote. This source confirms that wage dumping, I could say, is one of the causes of migration that gives continuity to the phenomenon through centuries. As the first reason linked to wage, actually the second is related to desire, and I quote, "Agricultural workers desire to develop themselves not because of a lack of money, but because that job gives them the desired development of their aspiration and progress," end quote. So there is, and it is acknowledged, a desire of personal development. So the willingness of betterment of their condition as requirement for a respectable life drives many of the Mexicans that wrote to the president to receive a recommendation to be recruited as bracero, or at least they use this gimmick as effective rhetoric to persuade the president, as did Severo Contreras from Yehualtepec in Puebla, in the state of Puebla, in July 1942. And it seems Severo incorporated the full responsibility of development to be independent, and I quote, "Then a non-civilized man who does not improve his life is a parasite, who is useless to his home and his country," end quote. So these letters sent to the president of Mexico shed light in the way they were perceived, and they made of the representation of bracero to be recruited in the program. But now, We may ask what the Bracero perspective about the work, about themselves and the relation in which they had to work, survive, and through which they could better their lives. The question, ¿qué es un bracero?, means what is a bracero, and is often asked by interviewers in Mexico and United States to understand the way in which it is perceived by those very workers who are labeled with the term. The Bracero Archive, which is online, collects hundreds of oral histories related to the labor mobility program, and among them there is a set of interviews which explicitly address this key question. So now it becomes clear the title of the lecture. In 2006, Veronica Cortés asked this very question to Guillermo Cervantes Manzo, who was from Villamar and Michoacán, and for 5 years was enrolled in the program and worked in the field of Arizona, California, and Kansas, picking beets, carrots, cotton, garlic, lettuce, onions, and tomatoes. And when the interviewer asked him, what does the term bracero mean to you? He distinguishes two different understandings of the term, which are related to two different periods of time, which somehow introduce a periodization for a cultural history of bracero, so to speak. And I quote, bracero, now it is nothing more than an offensive term, but before it was not. A bracero was just a person who was coming to US to work, to make an effort for working. He was not coming for something else. He was dedicated to work, end quote. So before the Second World War, in his view, the bracero was a non-pejorative term, considered as a general label for those who were trying to get a job. It was a term able to translate the effort of getting a job and of working. So in sum, it stressed more the hard part of work and workers' mobility. And after the labor program, in Manzo's view, its meaning changed, and I quote, but right after listening to the term, they give it another understanding, as if bracero is a person, not really a beggar, but a person of a very, very low level, end quote. So it was not like charity, but nearly a person at a very, very low level, a low social status. So the feeling of disdain for poor conditions of braceros is triggered by Manzo's words. And the interviewer at this point wonders about his feeling what is called bracero, but he does not feel offended by being labeled as such, while he had positive memories of his experience. Being a bracero is translated by Manzo with the possibility of gaining money through work, with his efforts and the efforts of his peers which had his same view, make the work pay off. So workers regrouped around this strategy. All those workers who were aiming at improving their lives quickly and could or were able to get more from work stayed together. It seems a sort of self-protection of their ambitions, probably a form of self-exploitation too, as they had to work more and accept coercion, but workers present it as something they are knowledge of. Improving their lives was a common desire of many workers, and it is also this desire that shaped the understanding of this term. Workers' experience gave a deep meaning to the term, but historiography addressed mainly the role of coercion, the logic of dependency, and the asymmetries in their relation with various actors. In workers' view, there is the desire of betterment their lives, which could result in a more balanced condition. It is a temporary acceptance of coercion, which translates into the improvement of living condition once back in Mexico. It is a strategy, also a collective strategy. As they said, to get together for those who are paid off with work. And this is explicitly put into place by Mexican contract workers. So the existing asymmetrical relations, which reflects into an imbalance, are identified, are used, and are turned into workers' benefits. So somehow we could say that workers' autonomy is expressed not only in the resistance of refusal of work, but sometimes also in its endurance and its use. During this program, various actors felt the need to express their perspective on such program and on Bracero's role. The program was managed by the state and started as a contribution to fight against Nazism, and it was a national effort that involved almost all Mexican states of the Federation. For these reasons, Mexicans debated about the program and wrote to various representatives to express their opinion and perspective about the program and Mexican migrants' role and their desires. So the issue of desires is always alive into the interviews and into the letters that are sent to the president and to Mexican officials. Interview Violeta Dominguez asked Hector Solis Fuentes about his memory of being a Braceros, and he felt proud of his work experience in the United States, and he felt not to be abused. So the mistreatment changed radically the perception of the experience of workers and the use of the terms they used to report about the US, which was gringo, as it recalls a structural dependency of Mexicans from the northern neighbor and his imperial policies. But Solis Fuentes was satisfied with this time as Bracero, despite having worked for the gringo, because he temporarily freed himself from the dependent relation that usually structured the connection between United States and Mexico. When Vicente Ramirez, another Bracero, is asked about how it does feel if called Bracero, he simply answered, feliz, happy. The interviewer asked for confirmation, and he answered again, happy. The interviewer sought for confirmation once more time and probably was incredulous, and he answered, I feel happy because it is a very daring work, very nice to be heard, end quote. So Braceros were intrepid and brave in his view. He was proud of it. And also he had a good time working in US fields, and his life was changed by this experience to the extent that they moved permanently to the United States. Even when his family wanted him back, as they thought he was suffering for going back and forth and then for moving there. But Ramirez provided a clarifying distinction to the interviewer. Working in the fields was hard, but he was not suffering in a broader sense. He accepted the compromise, and for this reason, being a Bracero was a positive status that gave him happiness. In a similar way, Ramon Avila Hernandez was asked by interviewer Laureano Martinez, and Avila Hernandez has a negative feeling about the term. I felt like I was rented there, rented for working, he said. And his answer recalls clearly the definition given to the program by Truman Moore in an article dated 1965 titled The Slaves We Rent. Braceros were considered rented workers, which could have freed Mexico from its dependent relation with the northern neighbor. In fact, Avila stated, then I tell myself, and I quote, the external debt, and quote, here we talk and think, but it would enough to pay with the rental of Bracero. In other terms, Avila Hernandez suggested to interviewer that as they were rented temporarily to US, this rental should be a credit in return of the money they owed to United States. That is to say that Bracero was very conscious not only of their dependent relation with growers and officials both in US and Mexico, but about a broader economic relation that structured these countries and the relation between countries of which they felt to play a role with. So the external debt of Mexico, which established a distinct dependency and reinforced the asymmetry between the two countries, could be rebalanced, in Avila's view, by considering their work as a compensation. So they felt Bracero's work was a credit given to United States. They were rented to provide US growers of a large credit, which have been compensated their country's debit. So this credit-debit relation, which was mediated by the temporary renting of workers, connected the large scale of North America with workers' arms. So there are clearly different perspectives on being a Bracero that may look antagonistic to one another. Actually, the very same Braceros have answered to this apparent contradiction while acknowledging how the specific subjective experience of the mobility process oriented their memory and feelings, and moreover, assigned a variable meaning to the same term. This tells us that coercion cannot be understood as a one-way top-down process. Coercion does operate on several scales simultaneously, from which some workers participating to a mobility program do not feel coerced, while the overall program and dependent relation it creates show many practices of coercion and the unbalanced relation between state actors. The same practices of mobility and workers' desires suggest they use the labor mobility program, despite its form of coercion, to better their lives, fulfill their desire, and they were conscious of being part of an intricate net of asymmetrical relation which they tried to use to their own wealth and benefits. And I thank you very much for your time and attention.